Earlier this year, at a sort of industry conference, a Norwegian man who I had never met before walked up to me and gave me a hug. I was a little confused by that. This was this burly, very blonde, middle-aged man gave me a hug and said, "You saved my life." Now, I was at this conference. I had just given a talk about some legal question related to government contracting. I could not figure out how that talk possibly could have saved anyone's life. And I was pretty sure I'd never met this person before. And as I tried to ask him how I had saved his life, he, it became clear that he did not speak much English. And so I became, more and more confused. Eventually, his wife, who spoke more English, came over to translate. She said that he had seen my company name on the little name tag that I was wearing from this conference. That he had been in the Norwegian Special Forces serving in Afghanistan. And that while he was serving there, his platoon had been attacked by a shoulder-carried missile from insurgents in Afghanistan. And at the time, very recently, his platoon had received a new radar system that my company, Northrop Grumman, had manufactured. And that radar system detected the surface-to-surface missile coming in and allowed them to intercept it before it destroyed their camp. And the only thing that he remembered from this incident, he remembered seeing, made by Northrop Grumman on the radar system, saw the name on my badge and thought, that's the company that made the radar system that saved my life. So when I think of, arms sales to foreign governments, now I have this association of this Norwegian man coming up to me out of nowhere at a conference to give me a hug. So as David said, I'm sort of coming at the issue of foreign arms sales from a somewhat different perspective, I think, than many of the people you've heard from. It's the perspective of someone who, not myself, but works for a company that sells a lot of weapon systems to foreign governments. And so from that perspective, I want to talk to you about sort of three different parts of how military sales to foreign governments work. I want to talk about the economics. I want to talk about sort of the strategic role of arms sales to foreign governments. And I want to talk about the sort of legal regime around both foreign military sales and direct commercial sales of weapons. As I'm talking, please interrupt me at any time to ask questions. I would love questions, and in particular, if I'm saying something that you don't understand, if I'm going too fast, if I'm going too slow, cut me off and tell me that. So I want to start by talking about economics, and we may end up using most of the time talking about economics because I think I want to sort of give the perspective from a business that sells weapon systems about how foreign arms sales affect the ability to manufacture weapon systems for the United States as well. So some of this may be things that you already know after the last week, but in the last year, in fiscal year 2018, U.S. companies sold about $192 billion worth of weapon systems to foreign governments. About $48 billion of that was through the foreign military sales program, with the foreign government funding the purchase, another $8 billion in sales through the foreign military sales program financed by the US government, and the rest, $137 billion or so in direct commercial sales to foreign governments. That's a lot of money. To put it in the context of the aerospace and defense industry as a whole, the year earlier in 2017, the aerospace and defense industry sold a total of about $865 billion, the US-based aerospace and defense industry. And so, that means about 20% of US companies' aerospace and defense sales were sales to foreign governments. So there are sort of two levels of economic effect of having sort of that much money tied up in sales to foreign governments. The first is sort of the direct effect. The direct effect is, the aerospace and defense industry as a whole employs about 2.4 million Americans. And so taking the 20% of that, that's a little less than 500,000 American jobs that are likely tied to American companies selling weapon systems abroad. But there's that direct economic benefit to the United States and to American citizens. There's also a sort of second order benefit to the US government because the ability to sell weapon systems abroad makes it easier for the United States government to buy weapon systems more cheaply. I want to sort of give a somewhat convoluted and complex explanation of why that is, that requires me to explain a little bit about how government contracts work. So indulge me while I sort of go on this detour through something that I am very interested in, but I'm not sure how many other people are really all that interested in it, but I hope you will be too. So US government contracts are typically structured in one of two ways, with one of two different kinds of payment terms. One kind of US government contract is what's called a cost-plus contract. And a cost-plus contract, it basically means that the government reimburses a manufacturer for its allowable expenses, basically for the money that it spends to try to perform the contract, and then pays an additional amount, that's the plus in the cost-plus, to allow the company to make a profit. So if a company to manufacture a fighter jet spends $100 million, the amount the company would receive under the contract would be the $100 million that it spent plus some additional amount that would be profit. And different contracts are set up different ways. In some cases, there's a fixed amount of profit you'd receive. You'd receive an extra $5 million of profit. In some cases, it's structured as an incentive. So, if you deliver the fighter jet on time, then you get $10 million. But if you deliver it late, you only get an extra $1 million. But the sort of baseline is, you get paid back for what you spent to try to build what you were under contract to build for the government. The sort of other major type of contract is a fixed fee contract, which is basically where a company and the government agree to a set price for the company to sort of manufacture a product. Now, there's a big difference between those two things from the company's perspective and in terms of sort of the risks the company and the government are taking on. But so the way one arrives at what a price ought to be is actually pretty similar in the two kinds of contracts. Because if a contractor is going to enter into a fixed fee contract with the government, it's going to try to figure out how much it's going to cost the company to manufacture what it's manufacturing, and then sort of take that amount and then add some buffer for profit and for the potential for cost overruns on top of that. And that's how it would determine the price that it would charge. So now a sort of key point, and here I'm going to go back to talking about cost plus contracts because I think it's sort of clearer to explain it this way, but the same thing is going to be true however a contract is structured. In a cost-plus contract, you can recover two kinds of costs. You can recover what are called direct costs and indirect costs. So direct costs are the costs you're incurring specifically to perform a particular contract. So, going back to the contract to manufacture a fighter jet, the cost of the materials that you are buying to incorporate into the fighter jet is a direct cost. The wages paid to employees who are working solely every day on the engineering and manufacture of a fighter jet is a direct cost. Anything that you would not have to spend but for the fact that you're building this fighter jet is a direct cost. Indirect costs are costs that a company incurs that benefit its performance of the contract, but don't go directly to the contract performance. So, and that, the company would incur regardless of whether it was performing that contract. So, for example, the cost of facilities. If you own a manufacturing facility and you're going to use some of that manufacturing facility to support building this aircraft, but you'd have to own the manufacturing facility anyway, the cost of that manufacturing facility is an indirect cost. The cost of having an IT system to run your computers, the cost of having human resources and finance personnel and paying the salaries of your executives, those are all indirect costs. Independent research and development spending is an indirect cost. So, the money a company spends to figure out how to develop a more effective stealth system that can then incorporate into, this fighter jet and other fighter jets would be an indirect cost. So, when a company incurs indirect costs, it allocates those indirect costs across all of the different contracts that the indirect costs benefit. So, let's take the example of that research and development spending to develop a new stealth technology. If a company has 5 different contracts to manufacture planes, all of which can use that stealth technology, then it would take the money that it spent developing that stealth technology, and it would allocate that indirect cost across all 5 of those contracts and get reimbursed by the government a share of that sort of research and development spending on each of those contracts. So, in a sense, the more planes using the stealth technology that the company can manufacture, the less the government has to pay for the research and development spending on each plane. Let's sort of take a concrete example. Suppose a contractor incurs $500 million in indirect costs that benefit the entire business. So you've stood up your IT system, you've hired human resources personnel, you've bought or leased facilities. The total cost of that is $500 million. If that contractor has 5 cost-plus contracts, and each of those contracts has $500 million in direct costs, then the contractor's total cost on each one of those contracts is going to be $600 million. It's going to be the $500 million in direct costs that it's incurring on each contract, plus 1/5 of the $500 million of indirect costs, because those indirect costs are sort of distributed proportionally among all of the contracts that they benefit. So, at this point, again, suppose this is a contract for a plane, if it's $500 million, it'd probably have to be for several planes. Even the sort of most complex bombers or fighter jets probably cost, in the neighborhood of $150 million or so. When those costs are distributed, the government, when the contractor has 5 contracts that the indirect costs are benefiting, is paying $100 million on each of those contracts. But if the contractor instead has 10 contracts that are the same size, then the contractor would only, to recover the full $500 million of indirect costs, the contractor would only have to charge $50 million of indirect costs to each contract instead of $100 million. And so as a result, the government would save $50 million on each contract because the contractor has more contracts to charge. So how does that relate to foreign military sales? The sort of main effect that foreign military sales have is increasing the base of sales that a manufacturer can make of each product that it designs, because it's selling not just to the US government, but also to foreign governments that might be interested in buying the same technology. And so by increasing that base of sales, the contractor can distribute its indirect costs more broadly and charge each of its customers less for the same thing. Let me sort of give another sort of concrete example involving a real airplane, the F-35 Lightning. So the F-35 Lightning is sort of the next generation fighter jet, sort of currently in development with Lockheed Martin, one of our company's main competitors, as the main company that's sort of building the plane. And my company sort of makes a number of the things that are integrated into the plane, including the radar system and some of the stealth technology that's used in the aircraft. So the F-35, the United States eventually wants to purchase by the year 2070 about 2,300 F-35 aircraft. Because of the possibility of foreign military sales, the total projected sales of the aircraft now are about 3,500 aircraft. So about a third of the total aircraft currently projected are going to be sold to foreign governments rather than to the US government. The effect of that is to reduce, probably by somewhere in the $10 to $15 million range, the average price of an F-35 aircraft to the US government. And so, specifically, because the contractors can reduce their allocation of indirect costs to the sales to the US government, they can charge the US government less money. The other effect, and I'll sort of keep talking about the F-35 here, of sort of adding additional sales, adding the additional possibility of sales to foreign governments, is to sort of increase the opportunity for economies of scale in production. Sort of the longer you're producing a particular product and the more of a particular product you're producing, the cheaper you generally can produce each one. And that's especially true when you're talking about major weapon systems like missiles and aircraft, where you're just not producing all that many. Like the total, if you're producing toothpaste or soap, the sort of total demand in the world for tubes of toothpaste is massive. Whereas the total demand in the world for fighter jets is just not all that big. So you're not producing that many fighter jets, and to get to an economy of scale in producing fighter jets, it's really important to be able to leverage as broad a slice of that relatively small world market as you can. So with the F-35, there are sort of a few variants of the F-35. So I'll talk about the F-35A, which is basically sort of the simplest of the three variants of this fighter jet. The initial price of the first F-35 aircraft that was built was $279 million for one. That was 8 years ago. The current price for F-35, they're now producing about 25 a year. The current price for one of those 25 is $89 million an aircraft. So basically, the price has been cut in about a third as the companies manufacturing it have been able to take advantage of sort of some economy of scale in producing it. Based on the projections of the US and foreign governments buying a total of 3,500 of these aircraft, the projected future price by the time you're at maximum production in about 6 years is only going to be $60 million an aircraft. Now, $60 million is still a lot of money, but it's a whole lot less money than $289 million. And that savings multiplied across all of the aircraft that are being produced flows through to allow the government to get high-tech fighter jets more cheaply than it otherwise could. Now, of course, you'd get some of that. The United States government is a big enough purchaser that you'd get a lot of those economies of scale just from the United States government buying all of the weapon systems that it buys, but adding the sort of layer, here for the F-35, it's about a third of the purchases are by foreign governments, In the average weapon system, about a fifth of the purchases are by foreign governments. That extra layer increases the sort of cost-saving benefits of the economies of scale. So with respect to economics, we've got sort of the direct benefit of sort of money and jobs coming to the United States as a result of foreign arms sales, and you've got the indirect benefit of the United States government being able to buy systems more cheaply as as economies of scale increase and as the distribution of indirect costs increase. Ernest, you got a question?
Yeah. Is your company, I know your company like competes with Lockheed Martin, but like, does it compete with like base systems in UK or is that like different?
So the answer is absolutely yes. I think so our company, about 85% of our total sales are military sales to governments of one form or another. Of that 85%, about 75% of it is to the US government and 25% of it is to foreign governments. The main foreign governments are the UK, Australia, Saudi Arabia, Japan, Korea, Germany, France, and as well as some to others. So in many of the sales we make to foreign governments are through the foreign military sales program. So we are interacting directly with the United States government rather than interacting directly with the foreign government. But we're still essentially pitching to a foreign government why they should want to buy our technology rather than the technology of a domestic military manufacturer or a different manufacturer. Sure.
Yeah. Sorry. So like you mentioned like selling to Saudi Arabia. Is there like a specific process that is different regarding like direct commercial sales to Saudi Arabia than like compared to the U.S. government selling arms to Saudi Arabia?
So absolutely there is, and you know what? Why don't let me see if I can take questions about economics first, and then get back to your question next, because that sort of gets directly into the sort of legal protections issue. That's one of the next questions that I want to talk about. Go ahead.
You said by the end of the year you would have to sell like a certain amount of F-35, but the Americans said they'll sell like 1/3 right now. What will happen to the other fighter jets that they
So I think, apologies if I was unclear, I think about a third of the total fighter jets that of F-35s that Lockheed Martin is projecting to sell are going to be sold to foreign governments. So, however, all of those jets are going to be manufactured only after there's a specific contract to sell them. So right now, that's the projection of how many F-35s someone is going to contract to buy before the year 2070. Right now, there are only contracts in place to sell, I'm going to get the specific number wrong here, but about 400 of that set. And so there are already plans in place to manufacture those 400, I think about 180 already have been manufactured. There are current plans in place to manufacture the other 220, but the remainder of the 3,500 projected sales, both to the US and to foreign companies, you're not going to start manufacturing until you actually have a contract in place. So if, for example, one were to sort of change the legal regime and reduce the ability of US companies to sell to foreign governments, the effect would be that one would just never start producing those planes. There wouldn't be sort of planes actually manufactured that would go to waste.
What if they already made the item, the other person canceled contract, the company canceled contract? What would you do with the remaining item?
So that's a really good question. In most circumstances, when a contract is canceled, what happens is governed by exactly what the terms of the contract are. So I'm going to talk mostly about U.S. government contracts because they're sort of standard U.S. government contract terms, and the sort of contracts with foreign governments might differ. But if you're doing it through the foreign military sales program, it would be the same terms that are in a standard U.S. government contract. Under those terms, basically anything that you have already spent to perform a contract, if the government cancels it for the government's convenience, then the government is still responsible for paying you anything you've spent up to that point. They wouldn't have to pay the full value of the contract, but they would have to pay you for everything you've already done. If, on the other hand, the government cancels the contract for default, basically sort of makes an argument that the reason it's canceling the contract is because the contractor failed to perform the way it was supposed to. For example, was supposed to deliver an aircraft in 2018 and it's now 2021 and they still haven't delivered a plane. The government could try to say that is because the contractor failed to meet its obligations, terminate the contract for default, and in that circumstance, the government likely would not have to pay any additional money to the contractor beyond what was already paid, and in some circumstances could try to recover money that it already had paid to the contractor. But most terminations of government contracts are terminations for what are called terminations for convenience, where the government essentially decides that it does not need what it previously had contracted to buy, or that sort of the way it's being manufactured and delivered no longer meets the government's needs. And in that circumstance, you basically sort of have to pay the contractor what it spent to that point, but not more.
Is there any chance you can go over the fixed fee contract again?
The what?
The fixed fee contract.
Sure. So a fixed fee contract works sort of more like ordinary commercial contracts. It's basically a situation in which the government and a contractor will agree before contract performance begins on a set amount that the contractor is going to get paid. And as long as the requirements of the contract don't change, that amount owed to the contractor won't change. Sometimes the government will sort of midstream change some of the requirements of the contract, and then there'll be another negotiation about how that ought to affect the price. And so in that circumstance, the fee might change. But ordinarily, so the other sort of key point is the way contractors think about fixed fee contracts is a contractor in deciding what price it needs to get in order to agree to a contract will think about it largely the same way as contractors think about cost plus contracts. They'll just sort of try to figure out, what am I going to spend to do all of this work? What are sort of the potential ranges of spending? What's the if everything goes perfectly, we are as efficient as possible. What would we spend? What's the average amount we'd expect to spend? What's the most we could possibly end up spending if everything goes wrong? And consider all of those inputs and try to determine what sort of reasonable price would be. So the other thing that I didn't mention about the way these contracts work is usually there's more than one contractor competing to be able to make the same thing. So right now, sort of a competition that's in the news right now is there's a sort of competition for what is the largest government contract in history. It's a 50-year contract to essentially remake the ground-based portion of the United States' nuclear arsenal. It's called the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent Contract. And right now, there are two companies, originally there were more, but the government has now selected sort of two companies that are left competing. One of them is Northrop Grumman, the other one is Boeing. And recently there's sort of been big news because Boeing has sort of suggested that they might want to withdraw from the competition because they don't think the terms of it are fair. But sort of in the ordinary circumstance, you've got multiple manufacturers competing for the same government business. And when there's a fixed price contract, each company will say, here's the price for which we would be able to perform the work. And then the government can consider each company's proposed price as well as their technical capability to do the work in determining which manufacturer will choose. All right, let me go back to your question and talk about the sort of legal regimes around direct commercial sales and foreign military sales program sales. So I think that you all have already heard those basic. Stop me if you haven't, and if I'm just sort of passing something that I should be explaining. there's sort of two main ways in which contractors can sell to foreign governments are through the Foreign Military Sales Program, which is facilitated by the US government, or directly through commercial sales to the foreign government. So, the key difference, in either setting, you've got three actors, and you've got a series of protections that affect the way those three actors interact with each other, that are designed to ensure that all sales are made only if it's in the United States government's interest for a sale to a foreign government to go ahead. So in the Foreign Military Sales Program context, that protection is the United States government being directly involved as both an approving and contracting party. So you've got three parties involved. You've got the foreign government, you've got the manufacturer, you've got the US government. In a Foreign Military Sales Program sale, there are contractual relationships between the US government and the foreign government, and between the US government and the contractor, but there's no direct contractual relationship between the foreign government and the contractor. So formally, the contractor sells, let's keep talking about the F-35, sells an F-35 aircraft to the US government, and then the US government immediately transfers that F-35 aircraft to the foreign government. In that structure, the sort of main protections that exist are, a requirement that the president have determined whether a particular country is eligible to receive foreign military sales, and then a requirement that the State Department, with the concurrence of the Defense Department, authorize the particular item in question for sale to the foreign government. There are some kinds of military technology, there's a pretty long list of technologies that can only be sold to foreign countries through the Foreign Military Sales Program that a manufacturer could not directly sell to a foreign government. There are other kinds of technologies that contractors could not sell to foreign governments at all, where there's sort of blanket export restrictions. So, in the direct commercial sales context, which you asked about, the contractual relationship is different. If you've got the foreign government and the manufacturer, there's a direct contractual relationship there, but the contractor also has a relationship with the US government. And the contractor's relationship with the US government is that the contractor has to get a license that basically amounts to authorization to sell this particular weapon system to this particular foreign government granted by the State Department. Although it is a different process, you nevertheless have a government process that considers both who's receiving it and what the it is in deciding whether to make a sale. You have a question?
Yes. How much would it cost for a company to get a license to sell, let's say, an F-35?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to it. There isn't the actual fee associated. There is a fee associated with the license, but that fee is a nominal fee. The majority of the cost would be what the company has to spend internally in order to do the legwork to demonstrate that the sale is legitimate, and I don't know what that how much that normally would be. I would guess it will probably end up being a few $100,000. It wouldn't be a massive amount compared to the price of an F-35. And the government doesn't typically charge companies for facilitating business with foreign countries. The sort of government I think views its role as trying to determine whether a sale is in the U.S.'s interests or not. If the sale is in the U.S.'s interest, it wants to, either by issuing a license or by sort of serving as the middleman in a FMS program transaction to facilitate the sale. But the U.S.'s goal isn't to sort of make money as a licensing entity here. So sort of in either, actually, before I make that point, let me take the question.
My question sort of was, historically, what has been the biggest customer for your company through the DCS program? Or like through direct commercial sales?
So I think the answer historically has probably been the UK, but overall, only about a quarter of foreign military sales are through the foreign military sales program, but we make a disproportionate percentage of our foreign sales through the foreign military sales program. That's largely because what we are selling to foreign countries, as opposed to what sort of much of the aerospace and defense industry is selling to foreign countries, focuses on the kind of large systems like radars and aircraft, and many of those are either only authorized for sale through the FMS program, or are sort of the kinds of large single items where if we end up in a dispute about that, so whether, say, an aircraft worked the way it was supposed to, we'd much rather be in that dispute with the US government as the middleman than be directly in a dispute with a foreign government in a foreign court. So as a result, we're typically much more comfortable selling through the FMS program than we would be selling direct commercially. But if you're selling sort of smaller things, the cost savings of selling direct commercially instead of through the FMS program is probably going to be large enough that you'll want to sell directly, and that's why sort of the about 3/4 of total foreign military sales go direct commercially, despite the advantage of having the U.S. government as an intermediary. So while there are key differences between FMS and DCS, from our perspective, sort of many of the sort of basic safeguards on how foreign sales work are common to both and are sort of based on the Arms Export Control Act, which is the statute that controls all transfers of military technology to foreign governments. And so, the sort of kinds of safeguards on what countries you can sell to, what kinds of restraints and control measures have to be in place around the sales, and what kind of determination of the U.S.'s interest in the sales has to get made. A lot of those sort of safeguards exist and are common to both ways of selling to foreign governments. So let me quickly talk about sort of some of the sort of military strategic considerations around foreign sales. And this is something that I think other people you are hearing from are more expert in than I am. So this is sort of how I and my company tend to think about these strategic considerations, but many people have studied these strategic considerations in much greater detail than we have. I think the way sort of our military customers in the US military talk about foreign military sales, they sort of cite three main categories of reasons why those sales are important. The first is in sort of helping to solidify the US's military alliances. Part of that is that the U.S. military, I think, has the view that they're in a better position to train with and ultimately, if necessary, fight side by side with allied militaries if they're using the same technology and the same equipment and the same terminology. So if, as happened in Afghanistan, you want to have an allied coalition fighting side by side, I think the U.S. military's view is it's easier to do that if you've got the same basic kinds of weapon systems that sort of all of the countries involved are using. And there's also the view that foreign military sales improve communication between allied militaries by providing sort of another sort of critical forum in which militaries can share information about the technology that they're using. You're buying the same aircraft or the same radars from from the same contractors, and the communication around those platforms, I think, is something the military has sort of viewed as a positive. And the other sort of military alliance benefit is that one thing that's really important to the United States is to be able to have a strong alliance, but given the United States' military superiority, the United States often might be put in a position of having to defend its allies rather than vice versa if its allies end up in a conflict. And giving its U.S. allies access to weapon systems that allow them to defend themselves rather than having to rely on the U.S. military to go in to assist in a defense, decreases the need for U.S. military intervention abroad. And so the second sort of major category of strategic benefits that I think we've heard from our military customers is that foreign military sales give the United States the opportunity to influence how foreign governments conduct their military activities. If the United States is selling weapons and can decide to stop selling weapons, then the United States can, to some extent, dictate whether foreign governments are using weapon systems reasonably, and if they're not using weapon systems reasonably, can say, unless you get in line, we're going to cut off your access to these systems.
Is there end-use monitoring in DCS, or
I'm sorry?
Is there end-use monitoring in DCS, or is that just FMS?
There is not the same kind of explicit end-use monitoring that exists in FMS and DCS, but there is, I think, general tracking by both the State Department and the Defense Department of how foreign governments are using U.S. purchased systems that influence the continued decisions about whether either FMS or DCS sales are going to be authorized. Sort of along the same lines, the ability of the U.S. to sell weapon systems to foreign countries discourages those countries from turning to, the other potential providers of weapon systems, especially Russia and China, as their sources of weapons, and so it allows the U.S. to be the one who's influencing their military decisions rather than Russia or China. And it also, discourages foreign governments from funding their own weapons development that might limit the United States military's insight into what capabilities a foreign military has.
Can Israel be an example of what you're talking about?
Yes, I think so. Israel is a country that, because of its perceived defense needs, I think would likely be spending a whole lot of money procuring weapon systems from some source, regardless of whether the United States was selling to them. And I think the United States, by sort of positioning itself as the primary supplier of weapon systems to Israel, has sort of been able to exercise some control over what weapon systems Israel has, and to sort of shape sort of what alliances Israel focuses on in the rest of the world. So the last sort of benefit of foreign military sales that we largely have heard from our military customers is about maintaining U.S. military superiority. And here I sort of want to introduce a concept of what in the military they call N-1, which is the sort of most advanced currently existing technology in an area is typically called N, as in the sort of, you could think of, I'm not sure if it originally stood for new, but you could think of it as sort of new, the sort of gold standard technology in an area. In many areas, especially with particularly sensitive technology, the United States will not sell N-level technology to any but a few of its closest allies, and instead will sell only N-1 technology. Basically, N-1 being the generation before the current most advanced technology. And so the sort of ability to control which generation of technology you're selling allows the United States to ensure that sort of some countries have, one step back capability only and helps the US to sort of maintain its military superiority and its position as a sort of leader in the global marketplace. Let me stop there and take any more questions that you all have.
I don't know if you can speak for like other arms producing companies, but from your company's perspective, does the company believe that the Arms Trade Treaty is too restrictive, or that the like Arms Control Export Act is too restrictive to like producing arms sales?
So I'm not sure that I can speak for other companies. I'm sure that there are companies that would answer that question yes. I will say I think our answer to that question is no. I think we are, and some of this is because I think we are focused on selling sort of major weapon systems like aircraft, and I think are focused on. I think we as a company would want to ensure that we are only selling those systems to buyers that are going to use them responsibly. I think the main, the majority of the safeguards in the Arms Export Control Act, at least in my view, are safeguards that are designed towards that same goal. Are there some aspects of the bureaucracy around foreign sales that I would try to streamline if I could? Yeah, probably. But I think the goal is the right goal, and we would want to see that goal sort of continue to exist in law. Sure. My name is Jay Cox, Jaycox, and I'm from Northrop Grumman Corporation. I do indeed. So I put together just sort of an outline of the notes that I was using here that includes citations to some of the public sources. Some of what I was talking about is sort of based on our own internal company data, but some of it is based on, a lot of it is based on public sources. And so that outline has the list of public sources. I've given it to David, and you all should get it.
Okay, so I know that you said that your company prefers to sell through FMS, but do you know if that's like a general rule for like most companies?
No, I think it's not. I mean, I think the fact that probably 3/4 of the sales are through DCS rather than FMS is a sign that many companies do prefer to sell through DCS. I think selling through DCS generally is, this is an oversimplification, but generally is cheaper and riskier. And when we're selling, because we're primarily selling sort of very big, very expensive systems, minimizing the risk is a priority for us, but sort of the cost savings of proceeding through DCS are a priority for many other companies.
What does your company do in the case of an embargo on a country that you guys usually sell to?
So the question was, if there's an embargo on the country we usually sell to, what do we do? And the answer is, we stop selling to that country. One of the constraints on sales is sort of compliance with any of the sort of export regulations and sanctions, and embargoes are one kind of restriction. We thankfully have not ended up in that situation recently, but sort of the one country where there recently has been discussion around sort of not an embargo, but an embargo-like action was Saudi Arabia, and we are very sort of closely monitoring our own sales to Saudi Arabia and how we would manage our relationship with Saudi Arabia if there were restrictions on sales. But sort of the baseline assumption is we would stop selling to Saudi Arabia as soon as those restrictions were put into place, and then we'd want to work out with the Saudi government how to deal with the efforts we'd already undertaken to produce things for them.
Since arms take such a long time to make and the process is long, how soon will you guys stop? Say that your contract is just about to go through and you guys are shipping things and then the embargo is in place, what would you guys do? How long would it take?
So it would take no time at all, or sort of same day. I think we would have a legal obligation to stop any sale that had not already been made. So the question would just be, have we already transferred custody of the weapon system we manufactured to the foreign country or not? And the answer is we haven't already transferred it. As soon as an export restriction goes into place, everything freezes, and even if we've got a completed aircraft that is ready for delivery, that completed aircraft is not getting delivered as soon as the embargo goes into place.
Sorry to interrupt real quick. We're going to take one last question, and then we'll start wrapping it up.
Great. Sorry. Go ahead. Why don't I take two?
Yeah, we'll take two.
Because I ambiguously pointed at both of you, I will take both questions, but those will be the last two.
If we wanted to stop a sale, who would be the actor in that situation?
To stop a sale, I think I think every actor involved would have some role in it, but I think the company would ultimately have the obligation to comply with, U.S. law, and so as soon as U.S. law prohibits a sale, the company would have an obligation to ensure that it is not completing any sale that would violate the new law. Go ahead.
What's your personal opinion about how arms are being sold to third world countries, for example Sudan, to start civil wars?
So I think that the question of whether arms are being sold into a situation in which they will be used responsibly, I think is a very hard question, and how to determine in which situations arms would be used responsibly, I think is hard. I think Sudan is actually sort of on the easy side of that question, because I think it would be hard to say, given the current political situation in Sudan, that selling arms into Sudan would be a responsible act. So our own policy, corporate policy, is only to try to do business in areas where we believe the weapon systems we are selling are going to be used responsibly. And that's sort of consistent with the sort of principles in the Arms Control Act about how the United States determines what foreign military sales are in its interest.
Awesome. Let's give a round of applause.
Thank you all very much. I really appreciate your great questions, and best of luck to all of you.
Thank you for coming in.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You can get any contact.